Okay, so we are ready to start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IPSOS Insights. Today's event is the last one in this year's series of client events and webinars. And as it has become a tradition with this last event of the year, we will focus on the global trends that we believe will shape consumer behavior next year and also for the years to come. We're delighted to invite Billy Ng to speak today. Billy has been with IPSOS for over 12 years, and she is currently head of IPSOS Trends and Future Consultancy based out of London. Billy will share some of IPSOS' latest insights into people's changing attitudes and values in light of COVID. We have about 45 minutes for the presentation. We'll have a short Q&A in the end. If you have questions as we go along, just put them in the chat box, and we will we'll cover them in the end. With that said, Billy, over to you.
Thank you, Asger, and good morning, everyone, from a slightly dark and rainy London. Thank you for introducing me, Asger. As he said, I'm the head of trends working out of IPSOS, and we're going to go through some of the trends that we think will shape tomorrow today. So hopefully this will be a morning inspiration for you. So just to sort of start and just sort of set the scene, the way we think about how change happens at IPSOS is via our theory of change. And this theory allows us to provide a way of understanding how human interaction shapes and is shaped by our world. So what it does is it looks at how change happens and operates across different timeframes through the longer term macro forces that you can see on the left, through to the medium term changes in society that you can see here in the middle, and also the shorter term signals, which are those that express real behavior change. So just to dive into those in a little bit more detail, the macro forces on the left affect the whole world and have a really high likelihood of happening. They're deep currents with very long-term and far-reaching impacts, and they tend to be the drivers of human systems. So to bring this to life, one of the macro forces that we discussed in our global trends work that we released in February this year was our fragile planet. And we know that 17 of the hottest years on record have been in the last 18 years, and 2020 is expected to be one of them as well. So this threat of climate change, which previously was obviously impacting animals, is obviously now knocking on our doors through what we're seeing in terms of floods, through fires, etc. And actually, you could say that an outcome of many of these macro forces could be the pandemic that we've seen this year. In the middle of our theory of change, we have what we call our shifts level. This is our meso level of change. And these shifts are really societal. They're very much person-centric, and they denote how attitudes and values of citizens and consumers, customers and shoppers are really changing over time in response to both the macro forces and the early signals. So to bring this to life, and we'll see shortly, there are rising attitudes that we are heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. So crucially, this is an attitude that hasn't been dented by COVID, and we'll come on to talk about that in a little bit. And then on the far right of our diagram, we have signals, and these are present day phenomena, which are really rooted in the changes that are happening right now. They're visible real world examples of the responses to both shifts and also macro forces. So a local example for you guys is on Black Friday this year, IKEA changed it round and had a Buy Back Friday campaign. And this is a signal of thinking about recycling rather than buying, so encouraging people to think about sustainable decisions when it comes to purchasing. Of course, we would be amiss if we didn't talk about COVID-19, and what COVID-19 has really done is been a real shock to this ecosystem. And initially, and I'm sure we can all see this in what we've been experiencing since March this year, is really through its huge global impacts, it's really drawn a tsunami of new signals which have had a notable effect on our lives. I know most of us will be sitting at home watching this presentation rather than being in the office. That's a signal of how this change has happened so quickly. But what we want to do today is really have a think about, have there been any other changes in this change ecosystem? So in terms of how we use this model at IPSOS, and also thinking about when I do my work in my foresight consultancy, it's really understanding how each level of change in this diagram is interrelating to each other, and also how the impact of COVID-19. And by understanding each of these levels of change and relationships between them, we can start planning and thinking about the future and what that means for our clients' business questions. We only have 45 minutes today, so we're going to very much focus this presentation on that middle level of change, which is the shifts level. And we're going to have a look at how shifts may have started to change based on COVID-19 and what that means beyond the pandemic. We're going to do this by looking at our IPSOS Global Trends Framework, which are the 12 trends that you can see around the outside of this circle. And this is a piece of work. It's a huge survey that we carry out usually every 3 years, and it tracks shifts over time back to 2013. So we precariously launched our last iteration of this in February this year, just before the pandemic. So what we've done is since then, in September, we did a mini look at some of the questions which denote some of these trends, and did what we call a mini dip to understand if we've seen any shift at this level of the change, the theory of change. We also, because we knew that this presentation was coming, we also carried out those questions as well in Denmark to give you a local read. So hopefully that will bring some local colour to the presentation today. So the way we derive these 12 trends is to crunch over 300 questions through various analytical techniques through to these 12 trends for 2020. So you can see they range from everything from climate antagonism, which looks at both the climate emergency, but also the backlash against climate change, which we see in some circles, all the way through to our brand trend, which is authenticity is king. And then also thinking about some social trends, such as reactions to uncertainty and inequality. But because we've only got 45 minutes today, we're really going to focus on 4 of these trends. And these are 4 of the ones that we've actually seen some change registered. And just to bring this to life in a bit more detail, we've obviously seen massive changes in human behaviour. And like I mentioned, most of you will be at home today. We've recently done some work with the Confederation of British Industry, and what they've told us is that they're planning to reduce their office space by 20%, which is huge. We've obviously also seen huge changes in the growth of e-commerce, which has been pretty much forced upon us as part of the pandemic, and growth in that space. But what we're really trying to do is understand, what really has changed from a more fundamental level, and what might stick post-COVID. So the question is, are really people changing? We've obviously seen this tsunami of signals that I mentioned. Here are some of the signals that we've been collecting since COVID started, and they are all available on our Global Trends website if you want some inspiration. But what this work is really going to do is have a look at these changes in attitudes and values. And we have some work from the UK around this, and we're sort of less convinced that there might be lots of change on this meso level. And the reason we think this is that back in September, we wanted to test our hypotheses. So we looked at some work that we did in Britain in 1999, and we reran some of the questions just before the pandemic. And we see that despite the internet penetration in the UK rising quite phenomenally over that time period, we see some fundamental values actually not changing or not registering any significant change at all. So even though we've had the war on terror, the financial crisis, and the launch of many, many different internet platforms and companies that we're going to be all using daily in our lives, we still see the same amount of people saying it's up to them to rely on their own principles. We still see in that time period the same amount of people saying that they wish they can slow down the pace of my life. So despite us all saying the world is changing too quickly now, it hasn't actually been any different from an attitudinal perspective since 1999. And also, I fear that technology progress is destroying our lives. And finally, that fulfillment in life is thinking about a position in your chosen career. So this was just interesting to us because it set our hypothesis that maybe values don't change as quickly as some of the fundamental behaviours that we're seeing. So as I said, to test this hypothesis, we picked 7 markets. And the reason we picked these 7 markets is because we looked at our IPSOS Essentials tracking, which is something that we've been doing over the course of the pandemic to understand how societies are moving through the different stages of throughout the pandemic and how they're responding to them, from, you know, not actually believing a pandemic is taking place through to sort of preparation, adjustment, climatization, and then finally slowly opening up and getting back to a new normal. So this is some data that we looked at in October, and you can see that in each market you've got a slightly different proportion of people in each of those stages. So in Italy, because obviously we were seeing the rise in cases again, we've got more people saying that they're getting ready for possible new restrictions, whereas in China, there's quite a lot of people compared to the rest of the markets that we looked at in terms of returning to a new normal. So we picked these 7 markets plus Denmark for local context. And what we're going to do today is just have a look at how some of those changes have registered in the lives of people. But just to sort of set the context first, in our latest What Worries the World work, we can see, and it's probably quite obvious, that coronavirus still tops the chart of concern. And this is followed quite closely by some of the elements that could be conceived as, you know, the parts of the fallout of the crisis. So the second most important issue to us globally is unemployment, followed by poverty and social inequality. And just to dive back down into that in a bit more depth in terms of health, we see that, you know, a large majority of people are seeing that coronavirus is the biggest health problem that's facing people. And this is quite dramatically drops to only 37% of people who are thinking about cancer, or just over a quarter who are thinking about mental health. And I think this is really striking, and I think it's a challenge for governments, because whilst coronavirus is obviously top of mind for all of us at the moment, we're seeing particularly, we've seen a fallout in Britain around this, in that some people are a little bit worried about going into doctor surgeries or hospitals if they have an issue. And we saw a big rise in people, you know, dying of these diseases because they're not showing up when emergencies happen. So this is a bit of a challenge for healthcare systems and governments to you know, remind people that actually that life does continue, and that there are other issues at play too. The other thing that we found interesting when we did our work, and this is based on the data that I mentioned. So this is looking at our 2019 data compared to our September 2020 data. So this gives us a pre and, I guess, during COVID read on how people are feeling. When we asked the statement, I feel very proud of my country, you can see significant changes here and significant increases in the people who feel this in Germany, Italy, Brazil, Denmark, and China. And it's interesting, and we've been discussing what our hypothesis is around this. And I think, relatively speaking, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and China have had good responses to the pandemic. You know, the governments relatively have been seen to do a good job. Perhaps in China, it's seen as one of maybe the most successful countries in terms of controlling it, but maybe at the price of civil liberties, which some of us would not tolerate. Brazil is an interesting one, because obviously we've seen that Mr. Bolsonaro is a skeptic in terms of climate change, and public health experts have suggested that his response is one of the worst in the world. But actually, what we've seen by understanding how that has played out on the ground is that lots of the public and local authorities have come together to work out what their response should be to the pandemic, because they realize that it is a threat. So what we think is that the pride in Brazil that we see here, the significant change in pride in Brazil, probably suggests it's this sense of the culture and the people of the country coming together around the pandemic. And obviously, not surprisingly, we see the US as the only country that we surveyed in September going backwards. Obviously, 2 percentage points is not a significant change, but it also highlights the time that we did the survey, which was around, you know, the tip of the presidential campaign, which obviously wasn't a time where people were feeling particularly pride in their country from that perspective. So interestingly there, national pride and people looking inwards is a focus of the pandemic. But that's interesting because if we juxtapose that by this question, which is when we ask people, globalization is good for my country, on this, we have seen that there's a long-term trend in more people feeling this. So despite nationalism, despite people looking inwards, and despite things like Make America Great Again, overall, we can see that it's only really the French that don't like globalization. And you can see from the trend over time, they've not been so keen on it. So it's interesting to see that despite the pandemic, that people aren't looking to ring fence their systems, and actually globalization continues in many ways. Linked to this, and for all of you on the call that work in the aviation sector, you'll be pleased to know that wanderlust is going up. When we ask the question, I would like to experience living in different parts of the world, we see the proportion across all of the markets that we looked at rising. So whether that's just a outcome of us all being sort of locked up and not being able to travel for much of a year, we'll see. But we know that companies such as Ryanair are predicting that their numbers will go back to 2019 levels as early as next year. And now that the vaccine's available, maybe the desire to travel is going up. So I think, you know, what this shows is that from a consumer sentiment level, people are still looking to travel. And it also reminds us that these big picture values that we see around, you know, the want to explore different places are slower to change. Obviously, given how businesses has reacted to this and how most of us have realized that we can work in virtual worlds and we can get work done, it might take longer for business travel to recover, but it certainly looks from this work that there is some pent-up demand from a consumer perspective. So that will be interesting to look at over time. To jump into one of our biggest trends here, the climate emergency, I think the first thing to say is that when we went into lockdown, there was a spontaneous decline in concern for environment change. And we think the reason for this is obviously when a huge issue happens, such as coronavirus, and we saw the same in 2018 after the crash, that when people have that immediate concern with losing their job, or just generally being worried about what's happening in the world, or concern about how they're going to pay their bills in the next month, or indeed something dramatic such as coronavirus is you know, threatening their health, we see that people tend to, you know, focus on that issue. But we've seen since then that actually the concern about climate change has actually risen. So it fell off a cliff at the beginning, but we're seeing that it's gone back up to the levels that we saw and more actually in a moment. And just to set the scene, this is a chart from our launch in February. And what we did is I mentioned that we crunched all of that data, those 300 questions, down to 12 trends. And we did this via a factor analysis. And these were the 36 values that we uncovered, which we then laddered up to our 12 trends for 2020. And as you can see here, climate emergency was the #1 value. It was the strongest value. It was the value that connected most people on the planet. And while people don't necessarily agree on how we should solve for climate change, they don't agree on the solutions that people and governments should attempt to do, we did see that it was the strongest thing that connected us. But just juxtaposed with that, down towards the bottom of this chart, you can see that there was also a significant proportion of people who said that they were tired of environmentalism. So of course, human beings are contradictory, and there can be some people who believe in the climate change crisis, but also have some concern with what's being spoke about in those in that space too. But nevertheless, climate emergency was our strongest value. And COVID-19 has really not dented this. So this is a chart that shows the data that we have in terms of people agreeing to we are heading to environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And we can see that we've seen a rise in all markets between 2013 and 2020, a significant rise in China of 12 percentage points between just last year and this year. And it's interesting because what we haven't seen a huge change in Denmark, and it's seen as a sort of, it's low in terms of the markets that we've looked at here. And we think that the hypothesis here, we see the same in Sweden actually, that it's if you rank climate change from a market perspective, it's quite low on the chart. And what we think is that because it's already quite a salient issue, I know that obviously the latest Danish election campaign was seen as the climate election, because it's such a salient issue, and because actually this question really focuses on, you know, changing habits, because that change has already been seen to happen. That's likely to be the reason why we're seeing low scores here. It's something that's already you know, happening. But yeah, interesting to see. And you know, it was deemed that 2020 would be the year of climate change, and obviously COVID-19 came to sort of overshadow that. But from a consumer standpoint and from an attitudinal standpoint, we can see that this concern continues to rise. And linked to that, we see that the trust in science is consolidating. So this is the tide of environmentalism value that we saw. And when we ask the question, even the scientists don't really know what they're talking about on environmental issues. You can see a downward trend in most markets here. And obviously that shows that overall trust in science is in the right direction, and COVID-19 hasn't really affected that curve too. So just to bring this to life in terms of some signals that we've seen. So this is, if you remember our theory of change on the far right of our diagram, these are the responses to the attitudes and values and also the macro forces that we see. Just a few here that we thought were interesting to talk about. So in the US, Burger King has partnered with a scientist to try and make their burgers more sustainable by developing a formula which allows cows to produce less methane. So an interesting one there. A local example that some of you may have looked at or used in Denmark is the Too Good to Be True app, which connects consumers with restaurants and supermarkets to reduce food waste. So if there's food that's going to go to waste, consumers can buy that for a slightly discounted price. And on the far right here, we see that some fashion designers have been teaming up to invest in mushroom leather as an alternative leather. And what I thought was interesting, just from looking at these three examples and also having a think about other things that we see, is that this focus on vertical collaboration throughout the supply chain is really helping brands tackle the climate emergency. So thinking more about the total value chain of our businesses rather than just what we can do ourselves. So to move on to healthcare and trust, and predictably, healthcare was probably something I was going to talk about today, considering the coronavirus. And in some ways, it's sort of predictable that there'll be more concern. What we've seen here is that health has really moved up the agenda. So this particular statement actually focuses on product. So if we ask the question, I will sacrifice convenience if it means getting healthier products, we can see agreement rising in all markets that we looked at. So people are really focusing on what they eat and how that links with their health. And I think for a lot of companies and brands, there's been a moment through coronavirus where people have been able to really take stock of their lives and thinking about health in more detail. Obviously, health is high on our agenda, and I think what we're seeing is that concern about health, people are now trying to think about holistically what that means. So this is obviously a strong link between what people are buying and what they're thinking about health, which is interesting. And I think during the pandemic, this taking stock has been quite prescient. I know that people who are living in flats in the middle of London or Paris or New York are also thinking about the mental health aspects. And, do I really want to live in a small flat in the middle of town, or do I want to get out and get some space and some fresh air away from the hustle and bustle? So interestingly here, health moving up the agenda, and actually it being more than just the pandemic and the threat to my physical health, but thinking more holistically about what that means. Interestingly, what we've seen is that faith in vaccines has dropped, particularly in the US and Europe. And I think, there can't be many people in the world this year that haven't escaped discussions about vaccination. It's worth saying that the work in all of the markets was done before the vaccine was announced, apart from Denmark, which was done after the vaccine was announced. So this is pre-vaccine, although we're seeing the same sort of story here. And this faith probably is this faith that has dropped is probably as a result of people worrying focusing on vaccine more, so it's a much more salient issue. So people are actually considering that question a bit more than they would usually do. I think there's usually only a couple of times in our lives that we may focus on vaccines, when we're potentially traveling or when we're having young members of our family inoculated at young ages. But now it's such an issue for everyone. People have really started to sort of consider, actually, do I believe that this is a good thing? And obviously we've seen a rise in sort of the anti-vax movement of late, particularly in the last few months. So whether it's just a reaction to this anxiety, we don't know, but I guess we have to keep looking at this over time. I think quite worryingly that there's obviously a link between the far right politics and anti-vaccine, but obviously the rollout does depend on us all looking at that from a societal perspective as well. And it's interesting. I was looking at these results and discussing it with our behavioural science team, and their views are that we need to sort of think about people's vaccines behaviour and their reluctance or refusal to think about vaccines more holistically than we do. So thinking about what their social formations are, what their the framing of their lives around them, what their environment looks like, and what that means in terms of why they are building these beliefs, in order to truly sort of think about the interventions that we need to put in place to get people thinking positively about vaccinations. But we've also seen, on a more general sense, that there's a rising belief in science. And when we ask the question, eventually all medical conditions and diseases will be curable, we can see that in many countries there's rising trust here. Obviously, the Danish results have gone down slightly, although not significantly. And I think this is probably to do with the fieldwork dates. So at the time of asking these questions, we saw the coronavirus in Denmark becoming worse, getting the cases were rising more quickly, and we think this could be the rationale as to why people have been more negative about this particular point. So to bring this particular area to life in a bit more detail, we've seen that Facebook have finally banned anti-vaccination ads, so really trying to tackle that hesitancy around vaccines. We've also seen a whole plethora of brands really responding to the pandemic, and this is an example from Burberry, who are buying into antimicrobial face coverings to help protect their consumers. And we've also seen, and I know I've seen data from both the UK and Denmark that shows that we've seen a huge rise in organic food and drink during the pandemic. So that would be a signal of how people are responding in terms of thinking about health, and what that means for what they buy. So that's just a summary of sort of the health trends. The last sort of area that I wanted to touch on is authenticity is a king, and I've called it authenticity is still king, because this is very much what we've seen in the data in terms of brands doing what you say, doing what you do, and being human and real, and that being absolutely key, and something that we've seen as even more of a concern for consumers during the pandemic. So just to take some data, and this is just British data here, but I thought it was quite striking, so I wanted to share it. We've seen a huge rise in the proportion of people who say they want to buy brands that reflect their personal value. So between 2019 and 2020, we can see that this has gone up from 56% to 72%. So this really underpins that point that when business is being tested, when the world is being tested, when we're in moments of crisis, people really remember how brands and people behaved, and this is really crucial for us to get right. Coupled with that, we've also seen a 6-point rise in the proportion of people who want bosses to speak out on social and political issues. So of course, not all bosses will want to be in the firing line, but certainly members of the public do want to see business thinking more about the world and societal issues than just their bottom. And if we this idea of doing good and doing more than just making money, if we look at the statement, it is possible for a brand to support a good cause and also make money at the same time, we see that COVID-19 has really left no space for indifference here. If we look at all our markets of study, we see that COVID hasn't made a dent in this. And in all markets, we now have more than 8 in 10 of the population saying this. And so, like climate emergency, this concern about doing good for society and for people rather than just making money hasn't been dented by the coronavirus. And I think we saw that through lots of responses to the coronavirus by big brands. But a contrast here, which has been interesting, and this very much contrasts with some of the globalization insights that I took you through at the beginning. We're also looking closer to home. So if we ask the question, I prefer to buy products from my country rather than from products from abroad, we see a rise across all markets in terms of people asking this. So from Britain on one end of the scale, where nearly 2/3 are asking, feeling this way, but also nearly 9 in 10 in China, which has gone up 15 percentage points. And what we think our explanation for this is that there's been really a feeling for greater resilience. Obviously, some of this will be thinking about national pride, but also what we see during times of crisis, and we saw this after the 2008 crash as well, that there is a real retreat to the known and the familiar, and people become quite inward looking. Of course, some of the macro forces around the world could have triggered this as well, such as trade wars, and that could be driving why people are feeling this way. But overall, it's a fairly clear trend. So thinking about how we can relocalize is going to be really crucial. Just thinking about shopping, and I know that many of us have been forced to shop online, and many segments of the population, of course, will be using online shopping channels for the first time, or using more online shopping channels for the first time. But in many markets that we see that there's more friction in e-commerce. And when we ask the question, I find shopping online more difficult than shopping in traditional stores. We can see significant rises in France and Germany, fairly big rises in Italy and Great Britain, and drops in Denmark and China. And obviously it means that you guys in Denmark must have your fingers on the pulse. You must be early adopters of technology and not worry about this at all. And obviously from a China perspective, relatively compared to the Western markets, they're very much a fully digitized economy. So that explains that. But in terms of sort of France and Germany and Italy, particularly France and Germany, we see that they're quite sort of hands-on, tactile shoppers. They like to shop locally. They like to shop for fresh produce. So that would explain here why we're seeing so much friction. But interestingly, it might not just be explained by demographics, because if we break this data down into looking at different generations, we see similar shifts from Generation Z as well. So even younger consumers are finding it difficult. And obviously, this shows that real life shopping is also important. This is a scene from central London on Saturday when the shops opened for the first time since our last lockdown. And you can see, this was actually a queue for Harrods department store. And of course, this time of year, we often see big crowds. But I think what this shows is that when there's a choice available, physical shopping does really have a role still. And I think that point about having experiences and having experiential ways of consumers engaging with your brands, plus the human touch, is going to remain really important going forward. But also considering the concerns that the majority of the population have around COVID, doing these in COVID safe ways will be really, really crucial. So to bring this trend to life in a little bit more detail, Nike is just one example of many of the brands that spoke out this year during the Black Lives Matter protests. And we see here that they turned their usual tagline on its head and said, for the first time, don't do it. And that was them supporting a huge movement. Another brand like IKEA boycotting the Black Friday celebration. So this is the company that actually sold their products for more on Black Friday than they usually do. And for those of you from the co-op who are on the call today, we were really impressed with the honest value range and this sort of focus on sourcing ethical local products. And this was a British example, but we thought that was a really good example of how a brand is responding to trends. That takes us through just some of the headlines, and it really is just a top line of what we've looked at in the survey. There's so much more under the surface of this. But what does this all mean for 2021 and beyond? And I think, fundamentally that the pandemic hasn't changed everything forever. We've clearly seen massive behavioural change. And I've taken you through some of the attitudinal changes, but there haven't been as many attitudinal changes and shifts as people may think. In terms of conclusions, I think obviously we saw this juxtaposition between globalization still being deemed as good and people wanting to live in different parts of the world, but also this desire for local products and national pride. And I think what this tells us is that there's going to be more focus going forward in and more importance for brands to really balance the global approaches. So thinking about how you take a global campaign, for instance, and make it more locally relevant. That balance is going to be more important going forward. In terms of climate emergency, obviously we've seen that COVID-19 hasn't dented climate concern, and trust in climate and scientists is consolidating. So this concern with the climate continues to rise. And I think my response to this from a 2021 onwards perspective is that I think through the coronavirus pandemic and people can see that governments and citizens can work together and actually can act quite quickly on huge global disasters. And if we come together as businesses, society, and citizens, we can tackle big, really hairy challenges. And together with this accelerated focus on climate change and the potential for green recovery, we feel that there's going to be more focus on this going forward and potentially more done in this space. Obviously, we've seen that health is more important, and that makes sense given what we've lived through this year, and that there's the belief in science hasn't really been affected. But also, we've got this slight skepticism coming through in terms of faith in vaccines. And I think what this really denotes is that health is going to remain high on the agenda for all of us. But we really need to think about this in both a trusted and transparency way. And these will be key to helping people think about how they tackle their own health, how they approach health, and how we as societies can get people thinking about taking the vaccines. And as I mentioned earlier, from a sort of interventions perspective, it's going to be really important for us to understand how people's beliefs are shaped by how their social and cultural and political views are coming together. And lastly, obviously, we've seen a huge focus on purpose throughout the pandemic. The attitudinal data that we've collected has not seen a dent in this. It continues going up. But there's also been a greater friction with online shopping. And we can say that obviously real life shopping has absolutely a place. I think I've heard a lot in the past clients talk about the death of the high street. And I always push back on that because I think it's not about the death of the high street, but it's about the reinvention of real world shopping. And I think the pandemic has really put that put a focus on that, particularly around safety. So in 2021 and beyond, I believe that there's going to be a greater role for brands being in the lives of our consumers in experiential ways, and also doing what's right for wider society. But this all has to be done in a really authentic and human and safe way. So just to conclude, I think despite vaccines, we have to recognise that we're really only at the beginning of the end, and we need to stay adaptive to really respond to this. And lastly, it's worth mentioning that we've really only looked at a fraction of what's changing in the world today. We've looked at the shifts level, and we've really looked at that in a very minute detail. But obviously, more shifts are at play. Macro factors will be impacting our businesses in the future, and we're likely to see lots of responses to this going forward from a signals level as well. So thank you for your time today. I mentioned our website. If you go to ipsosglobaltrends.com, you can find lots of free information here. We've got our report from 2020, from February 2020 on there. You'll see on the yellow strip at the top of this, we are collecting signals as a response to COVID-19. And lots of thought pieces and things around how trends are being impacted by the virus. So thank you for your time today, and I'd like to thank everyone at Ipsos who makes this happen. There's a massive group of people behind the scenes who can allow me to do this presentation today. So thank you for everyone as well. So that's it. So I guess back to Asker and to have a think about some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. It's very interesting. Feel free to to post your questions in the chat box. Billy, I will catch up on the questions. So there's already one from Maria. Maria wants to know, regarding the health concern, is it mostly related to corona, cancer, etc., or also broader with eating healthy, organic, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think the way we asked the question in the survey was about getting healthier products. So it didn't focus on whether they were food products or what sort of products. It could mean people are thinking more generally about how products play a role in terms of their health. But the sacrifice in convenience was really around the product piece. So in terms of thinking, obviously we saw in the contextual part that some of the bigger health issues that we've seen before coronavirus have really fallen down people's sort of consideration set. And I think that's a challenge for governments and people alike. So that's definitely something to focus on. But in terms of products, it's just generally people looking to get healthier products for sure.
Okay, so that's another one coming in from Jens. He says, "Hi Billy, thanks a lot for the great inspiration. Good to hear, Jens. A question: you showed an acceleration in consumers wanted to get healthier. Same for organic and local products. Do you expect a drop back to pre-COVID levels after we have the vaccines available, or has the COVID accelerated the mindset for good?"
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's definitely something that we want to track over time. I think what's interesting in many of the trends that we've seen, that have continued their upward trajectory, we've seen that COVID has accelerated and already something that's already top of mind. So my own personal hypothesis would be that it will continue. I think. I mean, personally, and I'm sure lots of people have found this as well, that actually having time to spend at home, you get to sort of really focus on yourself and think about your own health. And I think that's not likely to fall away when we get back to normal. Having said that, I guess the protection that the vaccine will give us likely will make people feel like superheroes again when they go back to the real world. So if we might see a sort of slight drop again, but it's definitely one to watch for sure. But I think in terms of sort of healthier eating and buying healthier products, I think people have found now through the pandemic that that's something they can do. I certainly are going to be more focused on my eating going forward because it's frankly cheaper to eat in, and it's actually, I found it quite easy to eat more healthily when I've been working from home. So I think there will be a balancing afterwards, but I certainly think that it's something that will continue in some shape or form.
Okay, thanks. So there's another question from Fadila, who wants to know, she says, "Thanks for a very inspiring presentation. You mentioned that consumers are more willing to buy locally. How willing are they to make the trade-off with price?" So that's a good question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I don't have the data to sort of think about that. I think we're obviously seeing that they're happy to trade off from a convenience perspective, but obviously once price comes into the equation, that might then be another element that becomes more top of mind and more of a concern. I think it's definitely something that would be interesting to look at. But yeah, unfortunately, we didn't ask the right questions in this particular survey, but it would be definitely something to explore, that triangle between convenience, price, and health. Definitely.
And how about results for Sweden?
Unfortunately, we don't have results for Sweden in this particular dip, but if you go back to the 2020 work, you can see, which is all available on the website, you can see you'll see Sweden in there. So hopefully some inspiration from that.
And maybe we can to some extent use Denmark as a proxy, or we can at least go back to the data to see how well Sweden and Denmark aligns, and then if it aligns, we can use Denmark as a proxy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so 2 questions came in. First one, thank you for your great job, very inspiring. Good to hear. First question, is your global trend analysis macro forces shift signals available for France? compared to other countries? And then the second question, you can cover them both. Second question, do you go deeper into health trends, for example, immunity, anti-stress?
Yeah, so good question. So if you look on the website, we looked at the macro forces because they are global forces. We looked at those on a global level. They're evidence, so there will be some data points from different markets. So feel free to have a look and on there from that perspective. Shifts is where we have the biggest data sets. This is where we did our IPSOS primary research, and we have all of these questions broken down by market. So like I say, that the mini dip that we did in September and October in these 8 markets, and we have only a handful of questions because what we were really trying to do is test our hypotheses that values don't change so quickly. So we've got some data around that. But the survey that we did last year, which we released in February, we have over 300 questions, and we have those broken down across 33 markets around the world, including both France and Sweden. So yeah, that's available, and I'm happy to discuss that in more detail. Asker, remind me of the second part of that question, please.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you go deeper into health trends, for example, immunity, anti-stress?
Yes. Yeah, so we do have, I'm trying to think, in the main edition that we launched in February. Again, there's lots on health there. You'll see that what we've done is we laid out the macro forces, we dived into the 12 trends in detail, and then at the end we have our colleagues around the Ipsos world that work in the different industries have reflected on what those trends mean for their industry. So there's definitely 1 or 2 articles on what the trends mean for healthcare, and we've definitely covered mental well-being. Immunity, I don't think we've got in a lot of detail, I must say, but there's general health, and there's definitely the physical versus mental health divide for sure.
Okay, good. And David wants to know if we have any data on Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, emerging countries.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The only market that we covered in Africa was South Africa. We have, I'm trying to think off the top of my head which markets we have in Asia. We do have some in Asia. If you'd like to drop me an email, David, I can follow up specifically on that. I need to go back to the and I can send you a link which will show you all of the markets that we looked at.
Good. Are there any more questions, thoughts, reflections? No, it doesn't seem so. No. Okay, so I think that we are at the end then. But thank you, all of you, for participating and for your interesting questions. And of course, thank you very much to you, Billy.
Pleasure.
Super interesting. So this is the last event for this year, but we'll be back next year with a series of new events. So keep an eye out for the invitation. We will send you an invitation, and it will be on our website as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Billy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Merry Christmas. Bye. Bye.